A lot of people don't actually know how much of a technical marvel or how ahead of its time this game was. But how ahead of its time was it? Well, shut up, go get a coffee and I'll explain it to you. Now speaking of coffee, if you want to go ahead and go above and beyond and support me, you can go ahead and become a coffee member. Link to that is down in the description below. You'll get access to these videos early and you'll get your name at the end of every video. Wow, what an incentive. Fucking shameless. So Jak And Daxter for the PS2 was nothing short of a marvel for its time. I mean truly, the budget for this game was around $14 million and had around 35 people working on this game over a 2 to 3 year time frame. Now for the time, $14 million, I know it doesn't sound like too much now, but for the time back in 2001 when this game was released, that was a pretty sizable budget. It was pretty much up there with some movie budgets like Legally Blonde, Jeepers Creepers, Not Another Teen Movie, Joe Dirt. They all had a budget ranging from $10 to $18 million. So for a game to get a budget that's comparable to a movie, it was a pretty big deal back in the day. Now this was also quite new for Naughty Dog at the time because their previous games, namely Crash Bandicoot, only received budgets ranging from $1.7 million for Crash Bandicoot 1, $2 million for the second Crash, and $2.2 million for the third Crash. Safe to say that the money and investment on the line for Jak And Daxter, again sitting at $14 million, was a significant jump in budget to what Naughty Dog were used to. So what did they do with this increased budget? Nothing much, just created one of the best platforms ever made and got rid of the need for loading screens, had ex-Disney animators working full-time on the game, made a revolutionary platformer that had some of the tightest controls, created an incredible world and story that would go on to spawn 2 exceptional sequels, a racing game, some decent PSP games, and then leaving fans with a giant gaping hole in their heart when nothing new would be added to the franchise after this last game released in 2009 with Lost Frontiers. That's a lot to unpack, but let's start with the then president and also co-founder of Naughty Dog, Jason Rubin, who himself at a very early stage in the game's development knew just how special this game would be. There was no fear, no trepidations, just pure passion and confidence to bring this new, refreshing and innovative game to the masses.
I also think graphically we're going to set a new standard and people are going to want to play in a world that's really absolutely beautiful and extremely immersive. And I guarantee word of mouth is going to carry the game. So I have no fears. I really have no fears.
And that confidence was not misplaced at all. Jak And Daxter would go on to sell 3.6 million copies globally. Just by 2002, simply 1 year after the game was released, more than 1 million copies were sold in the US alone. It also received a gold prize in Japan for selling over 500,000 units and sits at a moderate 17th position for the highest selling game on the PlayStation 2 console. These numbers by today's standards are very low. You need to understand this is 20 years ago, but back then this was huge. It also received some of the highest review scores on the console as well, with a 9.4 from IGN, a 90 on Metacritic, an 8.8 from GameSpot, a 9.25 from Game Informer, and a 4.5 star rating from GameSpy. Now, critical acclaim aside, this game was also a technical marvel. Probably a little too much for its time, and I'll get into that in a second. But what made this game so special?
They did a lot of tricks. A lot of expected ones and a lot of unexpected ones. They wanted to get the most out of the PS2. Well, actually I would argue they did get the most out of the PS2.
We had like completely custom tools and completely custom way of using all the hardware. Made stuff back and forth between all the different processors and like did weird stuff on the old PlayStation 1 processor you weren't supposed to, and it was just a very complicated design.
And looking under the hood, yes, it was a surprise to see that much code.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
So for those of you who don't know, Jak And Daxter was one of the first, if not one of the more prominent games released on the PS2 that didn't actually have loading screens.
Yeah, so when we sat down and brainstormed after the close of Crash Team Racing and we're looking at the PlayStation 2 hardware, we're like, okay, this world has to be seamless. We don't want any loads. It's got to feel immersive, and we don't want there to ever be a break from the action or a chance for you to say, oh, now's the time for me to put down the controller, I finished that level, you know, and you're just always in the world, it's always on. There's a day and night cycle, so it's always changing and evolving, and you really feel like you're part of that world.
It's details like these peppered throughout the entire game that also just made it feel like it was well within a league of its own. And as previously mentioned, there were animators who used to work at Disney animation studios that worked on Jak and Daxter, so there's no wonder why the animation was such a strong component of this game.
The animation of the main characters like Jak and Daxter, John Kim did it all himself, and oh my god, it blew my mind.
Oh yeah, this little space, and Jack's cool little water waddle. I love, look at Daxter shivering. That was John Kim touch.
Characters were far more expressive than basically anything seen on the PS2 at the time. And small but significant things like animation cycles changing when Jak does something as simple as go into water just added to the overall realism and immersion to this game. What's more impressive than the animations is the length that Naughty Dog needed to go to get this game to run on the limited hardware of the PS2. You see, back in the day, there was just no way a game as ambitious as Jak and Daxter was gonna run with conventional game development methods on the PlayStation 2. This left Naughty Dog with two options. Number one, they could think outside of the box and get creative and find a way to make it work, or they can pull back on the aspirations. What did they do? Well, they kind of broke the PlayStation 2, in a sense. They made their very own programming language that the entire game basically ran on. It was called G.O.A.L, and this stood for Game Oriented Assembly Lisp. Now, I've linked an article in the description below if you want to go into the deep dive as to how G.O.A.L actually helped Jak and Daxter be able to run on the PlayStation 2, but if you want a quick summary, here it is. So 500,000 lines of code were written in G.O.A.L. G.O.A.L allowed code to be compiled, downloaded, and linked without interrupting gameplay. It was all in real time. It also allowed data to be inspected or modified live, and had rapid tuning and debugging. But what does all of this mean? Well, it allowed the developers to essentially get around the limiting parameters of the PlayStation 2 and allowed Naughty Dog to achieve a myriad of things. Things like no loading screens, eradicating the appearance of level of detail pop-ins. This is where there is a low-res model in the background, but as you get closer to it, the game will swap it out to a higher res version of that model. Now, in some games, this swap happens right in front of you, so it can be quite distracting and quite jarring. But in this game, there is actually quite a lot of tricks to hide the camera or hide the models away from you, and while that's hidden, the models will be swapped out, so when the camera pans back, you'll have a higher resolution model, and it just feels seamless. It also means that you rarely get those distracting pop-in textures that you see in other games, and on top of all that, this software also unified the operation codes across the PlayStation 2's processors. Instead of the developers being restricted by the PlayStation 2 in a conventional way to make games, this new language allowed Naughty Dog to look at the PlayStation 2 and say, nah, you're doing this our way. The PlayStation 2 was literally at the mercy of Naughty Dog. Through this method of game development, Naughty Dog was quite literally able to squeeze every single bit of power out of the PlayStation 2, more so than what anyone had thought possible. Now, I am anticipating some comments saying, well, it didn't break the PS2, it's being hyperbolic. This is YouTube. But what I mean when I say it broke the PlayStation 2, it broke what was once thought possible on the console. It broke and elevated the standard for the console. It broke the power limitations and the parameters that were set by the console, obviously keeping in line with the hardware limitations, but it far exceeded anything that was being done at the time. Now, if all of that wasn't enough for you, Naughty Dog were also able to make this game run at 60 frames a second. Granted, it wasn't perfect when there was a lot of echo or just a lot of assets on the screen. It did drop a little bit, but for the most part, it held a pretty stable 60 frames a second. So a quick recap, a 2001 PS2 game was running at 60 frames a second, had dynamic day and night cycles, no loading screens, a new software language written purely for this game that pushed the console past its foreseeable limits, all while giving us the most visually pleasing, satisfying tellings of a young boy oblivious to his impending fate. Ladies and gentlemen, this is how you make a game. This is how you push the needle forward, and this is how you revolutionize gaming itself. This game quite literally changed the industry, both from a player's perspective and a developer's perspective, to redefine what is or isn't possible and what to expect from games, especially back in 2001 when this became the industry standard. But guys, that is the video for today. Let me know if you've played Jak and Daxter. Do you like it? Have you played the franchise? What's your favorite Jak and Daxter game? Did you realize how much work and trickery went into getting this game to run as well as it does? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, if you liked the video, leave the video a like and sub to the channel. And if you want to have access to these videos early, consider becoming a Ko-fi supporter like these beautiful people on screen now. But that's all for today, guys. Take care, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Who knows, maybe I'll do one of these for Jak 2.